They didn't die quietly. That's the first lie people tell themselves when they hear about a Hollywood tragedy. That it was peaceful, that it was sudden, that it was merciful. It wasn't. 2 bodies, a locked home, no forced entry, and wounds that told a story far more violent than anyone was ready to hear. So let me ask you something right now, and don't answer too quickly. What if the people we trust the most are the ones who know exactly how to destroy us? Because this story isn't just about a famous filmmaker and his wife found dead inside their Los Angeles home. It's about what happens when legacy becomes leverage. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. When family becomes a weapon, and when truth is buried so deeply that even authorities hesitate before pulling it out. Stay with me, because the official version is only the surface. And everything underneath is darker. Much darker. On the afternoon of December 14th, paramedics were called to an upscale hillside property just after 3:30 p.m. The dispatcher's notes were short, vague, almost casual, unresponsive adults, possible welfare check. But when first responders arrived, they didn't find a medical emergency. They found a crime scene. Blood, not splatter, pools, defensive wounds, signs of a struggle that didn't end quickly or quietly. The victims were Elias Reiner, a legendary filmmaker whose work had shaped generations, and his wife, Mara Reiner, a woman known publicly for elegance and privacy, and privately for something far more complicated. The coroner would later describe their deaths with a phrase that sounds clinical but should make your stomach turn. Multiple sharp force injuries. Let that sink in. Multiple. Not one. Not two. Enough to tell investigators that rage was involved. Or fear. Or both. Now here's where the story twists. Because before the sun went down, before the press even arrived, before the names were officially released, detectives were already looking at someone inside the family. Not a stranger. Not a burglar. Not some faceless intruder. Someone who had been there before. Someone who knew the layout of the house. Someone who knew when the doors would be unlocked. Someone who knew exactly where the knives were kept. And that's when the first contradiction appeared. Because the house showed no signs of forced entry. No broken windows. No kicked-in doors. Nothing stolen. Just 2 people dead in their own home. So ask yourself, who walks into a house like that without raising suspicion? Who belongs there? As the news broke, the public reaction followed a familiar pattern. Shock, grief, nostalgia. Clips from old films flooded social media. Interviews resurfaced. Smiling red carpet photos replayed on loop. But behind the scenes, law enforcement wasn't looking backward. They were looking inward, specifically at the Reiner family. Within 24 hours, rumors began circulating, quietly at first, then louder. A son had been taken in for questioning, then released, then brought back, then held. His name was Jonah Reiner, 32 years old, lived nearby, had access to the property, and according to neighbors, had been seen arguing with his parents weeks earlier. Arguments happen in families. That alone proves nothing. But this wasn't just any argument. It was about money, control, and something far more dangerous, the future of the Reiner legacy. You see, Elias Reiner wasn't just a filmmaker. He was an empire. Production rights, royalties, unreleased projects, old contracts worth millions. And according to sources close to the family, not everyone agreed on who should control it all. Especially not Jonah. Especially not after what happened 6 months earlier. Because 6 months before the murders, something changed inside the Reiner household. A legal restructuring. Quiet. Private. Almost invisible. Elias had rewritten parts of his estate plan. And one name appeared less frequently than before. Jonas. Now pause for a second. If that's true, what would that do to someone who believed the legacy was already theirs? What would it do to someone who felt erased? Ignored? Replaced? Police won't say exactly what triggered their focus on Jonah. Not officially, but sources say it wasn't just motive. It was behavior. According to investigators, Jonah arrived at the house less than an hour after the estimated time of death, before any emergency calls had been made public. Think about that. How did he know something was wrong? How did he know to come? When questioned, Jonah reportedly said he had a feeling. A feeling. Is that coincidence? Or conscience? Here's where things get even stranger. Because the crime scene didn't match what police expected, there was no sign of a prolonged chase. No overturned furniture. No broken glass. which suggests something deeply unsettling. The victims may have let their attacker inside willingly, may have trusted them, may have been speaking calmly just moments before everything turned violent. Imagine that moment. A conversation at the kitchen counter, a disagreement that escalates, a voice raised, a door locked behind them, and then silence. But silence doesn't mean peace. It just means no one was there to hear them scream. As the investigation unfolded, another name began circulating quietly among insiders. Not Jonah. Jake. Jake Reiner. The older brother. The successful one. The one who had distanced himself from the family years earlier. Moved out. Built his own career. Publicly praised his parents. Privately resented them. And unlike Jonah, Jake had something else. Influence. Connections. A reputation for staying clean while chaos followed him. Here's the contradiction investigators couldn't ignore. Jake had an alibi. Jonah didn't. But Jonah had a temper. Jake had patience. So which one scares you more? The person who explodes? Or the person who waits? Now let me ask you this, and really think about it. If you wanted to destroy someone and never touch the weapon yourself, what would you do? Would you argue? Or would you orchestrate? Because some investigators began to suspect this wasn't a crime of passion. It was a crime of positioning. And then something unexpected happened. A sealed document surfaced. A letter written by Elias Reiner just weeks before his death. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a will. It was a warning, written in careful language, almost apologetic, as if he knew something was coming, as if he was afraid of his own family. And that's when the narrative shifted. Because this was no longer about who stabbed whom. It was about who set the stage, who applied pressure, who whispered in the dark, who turned brother against brother, and who stood to gain when the blood dried. The authorities released a brief statement days later. Cause of death, multiple sharp force injuries. Time of death, mid-afternoon. Suspect, in custody. But behind closed doors, the investigation was far from settled. Because evidence doesn't always tell the whole story. People do. And the people closest to Elias Reiner were hiding something. Something that didn't start the day he died. Something that had been building for years. And in the next section, we're going to rewind. Back before the fame. Before the fortune. Before the resentment. Back to the moment the Reiner family first began to fracture. And the decision that may have sealed their fate long before a single blade was raised. They called him a genius. The kind of filmmaker whose name alone could fill theaters decades after a movie premiered. But genius has a price. And in the Reiner household, that price wasn't just sleepless nights on set or tense studio meetings. It was family. Elias Reiner wasn't born into fame. He was born into quiet obscurity in a Midwestern town where the biggest scandal was a high school football game gone wrong. From an early age, he showed brilliance, a way of seeing stories in people that others couldn't. Teachers noticed it. Neighbors noticed it. His parents, however, did not always understand it. They were practical, grounded. Elias was a dreamer. By his 20s, Elias had moved to Los Angeles, armed with little more than ambition and a reel of short films he'd shot with friends in his cramped apartment. But talent has a way of speaking for itself. Studio executives began to notice. Producers called. Opportunities arrived, almost out of nowhere. And then, with his first feature film, Elias Reiner cemented his place in Hollywood. Mara Reiner entered his life like a quiet storm. Graceful, smart, fiercely loyal. She didn't need the spotlight, but she had a sharp mind that matched Elias's vision. They married young, navigating the dizzying world of Hollywood together. From the outside, they seemed untouchable, glamour, wealth, influence. But that's the illusion. All families, even the most perfect ones, have cracks. Their first son, Jonah, arrived when Elias was already making waves in the film industry. The attention shifted. Suddenly, Jonah was the center of a small universe, and Elias's time and energy were divided between work and fatherhood. That division planted seeds of tension. Jonah grew up sensing the unspoken rules of the Reiner household. You excel, or you disappoint. You obey, or you're invisible. Jake, the older brother, was different. He was the child who seemed to float above conflict. Calm, calculated, charming. He understood the weight of his father's empire better than Jonah did. But there was another side to Jake, one that was rarely seen. He observed, measured, and remembered. Every slight, every perceived injustice was filed away in a mental ledger that no one but him could read. By the time both sons were teenagers, The cracks had widened into fault lines. Mara tried to mediate, but the tension between her husband and sons was subtle yet pervasive. Jonah felt pressure to live up to an image he didn't understand. Jake felt pressure to navigate the family's expectations while hiding his own ambitions. And Elias, focused on his career, sometimes overlooked the brewing storm at home. Hollywood wasn't kind to personal lives. Studios demanded success. Fans demanded perfection. The Reiner family's reputation became a double-edged sword. Behind the red carpets and movie premieres were heated arguments in kitchen corners, whispered threats in hallways, and simmering resentment that no one addressed openly. The family vacations, the public appearances, the dinners with influential friends, all of it masked a deeper, more complicated reality. Jonah's impulsive temper collided with Elias's meticulous planning. Jake's silent, calculating nature clashed with Mara's attempts to keep peace. And the resentment, left unchecked, grew like an underground current, invisible on the surface but powerful enough to shape the future. Then came the first turning point. Elias, now at the peak of his career, began to make significant changes to his estate. Production rights, royalties, unreleased projects, all of it was carefully accounted for. But the changes didn't just reflect business acumen. They reflected trust, loyalty, and perhaps suspicion. Names were added. Names were removed. And the sons noticed. Jonah, naturally impulsive, didn't take it well. He saw the shifting documents as a betrayal. "Why am I not included?" he reportedly asked. Jake, meanwhile, observed quietly. No confrontation. No outburst. But the seeds of strategy were planted. Jake understood leverage. He understood timing. He understood consequences. And in a family as complex as the Reiners, timing was everything. Friends and neighbors at the time noticed subtle changes too. Jonah was increasingly isolated, frustrated by the invisible boundaries of his parents' decisions. Jake, outwardly unaffected, began spending more time away, cultivating a persona of independence while quietly observing family dynamics. Mara tried to maintain harmony, but even her interventions had limits. She could mediate, but she couldn't rewrite history or undo the decisions that were already made. And then there was the public pressure. Every new film, every award, every magazine article added fuel to an already volatile situation. Jonah began to feel overshadowed. Jake, outwardly calm, quietly collected information. He noted conversations, patterns, schedules. And while everyone else focused on appearances, Jake was focusing on leverage, though no one realized it yet. By the time Elias turned 75, the family had become a high-stakes chessboard. Moves were calculated. Reactions were monitored. Alliances formed and dissolved like shifting shadows. And beneath it all, Mara watched, quietly protective, but powerless to prevent the storm that was gathering momentum. Then, a private event accelerated the tension. A legal restructuring. The details were complex, almost imperceptible to outsiders, but in practice, it altered the family hierarchy. Jonah's influence over certain aspects of the empire diminished. Jake's position, quietly stable, became even more secure. And Elias, unaware of the emotional fallout, continued to focus on his craft, assuming his family's loyalty was a given. But loyalty is fragile, especially when mixed with pride, ambition, and resentment. And ambition, as we know, can manifest in ways that no one anticipates. So ask yourself, what happens when a family built on talent, legacy, and public image begins to fracture in silence? When the very people who are supposed to love and protect each other begin to see each other as threats? The Reiner household, for all its outward elegance, was quietly unraveling. And as we move forward in this story, you'll see how those years of tension, jealousy, and hidden calculation didn't just shape the lives of Jonah and Jake. They set the stage for a tragedy no one could have predicted. But the first real cracks, the ones that would eventually lead to catastrophe, didn't appear in headlines or social media. They appeared in small, almost invisible ways. A missed phone call, a harsh word at dinner, a secret meeting in a study. And in families like the Reiners, those small cracks can become fissures that no one can stop. The first signs were subtle. So subtle, in fact, that most outsiders would have dismissed them as ordinary family tension. But in hindsight, they were the warning signs, the early tremors before the earthquake. It started with Jonah. He was 27 at the time, in the middle of his own career struggles, trying to carve out an identity separate from his father's shadow. But no matter how far he went, the shadow followed. Every conversation, every comment, every family gathering reminded him that he was still Elias Reiner's son, before he was anyone else. He resented it deeply, and resentment has a way of twisting perception. Simple disagreements became betrayals. Offhand remarks became personal attacks. And over time, those small resentments began to grow into a quiet obsession. Meanwhile, Jake was the opposite. He didn't show anger. He didn't react impulsively. He observed. He cataloged. Every argument between Jonah and their parents, every misstep, every slighted word. Jake noticed it all. And unlike Jonah, who let emotion dictate action, Jake's mind was already forming strategies for the long game. Mara, as the mediator, tried her best. She scheduled family dinners, intervened in arguments, and attempted to maintain calm. But even her presence, meant to soothe, sometimes inflamed tensions. Jonah interpreted her interventions as favoritism toward Jake. Jake interpreted her interventions as weakness to exploit. And Elias? He continued to immerse himself in work, assuming that dedication to craft would somehow shield the family from collapse. The tipping point came one evening during a family meeting. The subject was finances, but as is often the case in families, money was just the surface. The real conflict was recognition, respect, and control. Jonah felt ignored. Jake felt undervalued. Mara felt powerless. Elias felt misunderstood. The meeting began civilly enough, but as minutes passed, voices rose. Jonah accused his parents of undermining him. Jake calmly rebutted, pointing out what he saw as logic and fairness. Mara tried to redirect, but the tension was too thick. And in that room, for the first time, the sons were no longer just brothers, they were adversaries. From that point forward, the house that once radiated warmth became a theater of silent battles. Doors slammed. Conversations ended abruptly. Glances carried accusation. And small actions, the placement of a document, a misfiled letter, an overlooked schedule, became weapons. Meanwhile, outside observers noticed changes too. Friends reported that Jonah had grown distant, more volatile. He was irritable at social events, quick to lash out, and often disappeared without explanation. Jake, conversely, became more elusive, maintaining a calm exterior but spending increasing amounts of time in private meetings, networking quietly, and observing family patterns. One incident exemplified the tension perfectly. Jonah had discovered that a particular film project, one he had hoped to be part of, was being assigned exclusively under Jake's supervision. To Jonah, this was proof. Jake was positioning himself to inherit not just influence, but power. Jake, on the other hand, claimed the decision was based on professional experience and skill. But in the Reiner household, perceptions mattered more than intentions. As the weeks turned into months, the undercurrent of resentment transformed into planning. Jonah began to make subtle moves, checking schedules, questioning household routines, and probing for weaknesses. Jake responded differently. He waited, calculated, observed, and in doing so, he made one critical choice: to never act impulsively, to ensure that every action could be justified and every reaction could be anticipated. Mara noticed the shift but struggled to intervene. She tried mediation strategies, counseling suggestions, even external advisors. But when manipulation enters a household, even well-intentioned interventions often fail. Jonah interpreted guidance as criticism, Jake interpreted guidance as opportunity, and the parents found themselves caught between the two. And then came the small, seemingly innocuous incident that, in hindsight, was a clear foreshadowing of disaster. Jonah had been left out of a decision regarding the management of the family estate. Jake had made sure the decision appeared procedural and justified. Elias had approved it, trusting Jake's judgment. But Jonah saw betrayal. He stormed out of the meeting, slamming doors and vowing silently to fix what he believed had been stolen from him. From that point on, the cracks widened. Small acts of sabotage, emails sent late at night, subtle accusations whispered during social gatherings, tasks deliberately delayed, became routine. The Reiner family, once seen as a model of collaboration and elegance, was now a powder keg. Meanwhile, the public continued to see the Reiner name as synonymous with brilliance. They didn't see the tension, the subtle manipulations, or the emotional fractures beneath the surface. And that's precisely the point. Appearances matter. But beneath appearances, danger grows. By the time this phase of tension reached its peak, Jonah was already developing dangerous habits. Late-night arguments on the phone, obsessive checking of family schedules, and secretive trips to locations connected to family business all hinted at a mind beginning to fixate. Jake noticed some of these patterns, but he kept his distance, never revealing awareness, always calculating how to use it if necessary. Mara and Elias tried one last effort to restore balance, a family retreat. A weekend in a secluded property, meant to reconnect the family and air grievances. On paper, it was a good idea, but in practice, it failed spectacularly. Jonah interpreted every comment as attack. Jake maintained calm but subtly shifted alliances, observing who supported whom, cataloging behavior in detail. Mara, exhausted and frustrated, realized she had underestimated the depth of the rift. It was in that weekend, surrounded by the idyllic scenery that should have offered peace, that the first irreversible step was taken. Not a crime yet, but a choice. A choice to see each other not as family, but as obstacles, competitors, even threats. And that is the turning point. The moment when small cracks became fissures. When resentment became obsession. When calculation replaced trust. From this point forward, every action, every decision, every interaction would be influenced by the growing tension. And unbeknownst to the outside world, it was setting the stage for an event that would shock the very foundations of the Reiner legacy. So consider this. When does conflict become dangerous? At what point do ordinary arguments transform into a prelude to tragedy? And when you look at families that seem perfect from the outside, how much do you really know about what's happening behind closed doors? It started with small incidents, almost imperceptible to outsiders. A misplaced document, a curt remark at dinner, a conversation that ended abruptly, tension lingering like smoke in a room long after the fire was out. These were minor events, yet in the Reiner household, minor events rarely stayed minor. Jonah's frustration had become an undercurrent of his daily life. Every move of his father, every decision his older brother Jake made, seemed to provoke him. He was hyper-aware of who had power in the family and who did not. He watched, he calculated, and he fumed silently. On the surface, he appeared functional, sometimes charming, sometimes distant, but inside, his mind was on a singular focus, reclaiming what he felt had been taken from him. Jake, on the other hand, maintained an almost eerie calm. He had learned to blend observation with action. He didn't act rashly. He waited. He positioned himself carefully. Where Jonah's anger was visible, Jake's influence was invisible. He made small, subtle moves, planting seeds of doubt, steering conversations, manipulating perceptions, without anyone realizing. And that difference in approach would prove critical in what was coming. The first visible escalation occurred over a dispute regarding control of a pending film project. Jonah wanted a leadership role. He believed it was his right. Jake was appointed by their father to oversee it. Jonah saw favoritism. Jake saw opportunity. Elias, unaware of the deeper emotional undercurrents, assumed the decision was procedural. Mara tried to mediate, but her presence only highlighted the tension. The disagreement quickly escalated into sharp words. Jonah accused his father of bias. Jake countered calmly, highlighting his experience and logic. The argument left both brothers seething. Jonah stormed out. Jake stayed, calculating his next steps. Mara tried to soothe, but her efforts only emphasized the growing divide. From there, the escalation became a pattern. Jonah began leaving notes, sending pointed messages, and questioning minor decisions in front of other family members. He was testing limits, seeking weaknesses, and venting accumulated resentment. Jake, always observing, noted everything. He didn't confront Jonah directly. Instead, he documented patterns, anticipating moments of opportunity or crisis. Outside the family, the public remained oblivious. Friends, neighbors, and colleagues saw only superficial interactions, polite gatherings, public appearances, and professional collaborations. But beneath the veneer, the family was fracturing. Every smile masked suspicion. Every handshake concealed calculation. The tension came to a head during a late-night family meeting. Jonah, visibly frustrated, challenged the hierarchy of the estate. Jake, composed, countered logically. Elias, attempting to remain neutral, inadvertently sided with Jake, emphasizing structure over emotion. Mara, desperate to keep peace, suggested compromises that satisfied no one. The meeting ended with Jonah retreating to his room, slamming doors in frustration. That night, Jonah made a choice that would mark a turning point. Alone in his room, he reviewed the family estate documents, the film contracts, and the personal letters he had secretly collected over months. His plan was forming, subtle, indirect, and potentially devastating. It was no longer just anger, it was strategy. Jake, by contrast, was already one step ahead. He had anticipated Jonah's frustration and had prepared contingencies. Meetings were arranged, conversations were carefully guided, and alliances were quietly secured with trusted advisors outside the immediate family circle. Where Jonah acted impulsively, Jake acted preemptively. Over the next several weeks, small conflicts intensified. Arguments erupted during breakfast, disagreements flared in the study, and tension permeated the home. Jonah's temper became more visible, his actions more erratic. Jake, ever the strategist, responded with calculated calm, never revealing his awareness but subtly guiding the narrative. Mara and Elias grew increasingly concerned. They attempted interventions, counseling, structured discussions, and attempts to mediate disputes, but every attempt seemed only to exacerbate the tension. Jonah interpreted guidance as criticism. Jake interpreted guidance as opportunity. The balance of power within the family had shifted subtly, yet irreversibly. Then came an incident that would mark the most significant escalation yet: the discovery of a confidential letter written by Elias. The letter contained references to estate plans and family responsibilities, and while not incriminating, it was enough to ignite further suspicion. Jonah saw betrayal. Jake saw a strategic opportunity. The dynamics had shifted from conflict to confrontation. From that point forward, every interaction carried potential danger. Simple household routines, like the timing of meals or who entered which room, became points of tension. Jonah grew increasingly agitated, questioning his father's decisions and challenging his brother in subtle but pointed ways. Jake, ever patient, continued to observe and adapt, turning every argument and every disagreement into data for future decisions. The household became a pressure cooker. The Reiner family, once known for brilliance and collaboration, now existed in a state of constant emotional volatility. The tension was palpable, unspoken but undeniable, and anyone walking into the home could feel the unsteady equilibrium, even if they couldn't name it. As the days passed, small provocations, intentional or accidental, led to increasingly volatile exchanges. Arguments moved from verbal disputes to physical gestures, slammed doors, and pointed accusations. Friends noticed Jonah's heightened agitation, and some expressed concern privately, yet no one anticipated the culmination of events that was silently building behind the closed doors of the Reiner estate. By the time the escalation reached its peak, the family dynamic had completely shifted. Trust had eroded. Loyalties were questioned. Every action, every word, every glance was scrutinized for hidden meaning. And in this high-stakes environment, one wrong move or one calculated decision could trigger consequences beyond anyone's control. But here's the critical point. The escalation wasn't just about anger. It was about control, perception, and power. Jonah's impulsive anger clashed with Jake's calculated strategy, creating a volatile mix that neither parent could contain. Mara's mediation became increasingly ineffective, and Elias, blinded by trust and preoccupied with work, failed to recognize the full extent of the underlying conflict. And that's when it happened. The first irreversible step. Not a crime yet, not a tragedy, but a choice, made in anger, in frustration, in ambition, that would ultimately set the stage for an outcome no one could have predicted. Ask yourself, when conflict escalates quietly, without external intervention, how far can it go? How quickly can resentment turn into obsession? And how close are we, in families like this one, to tragedy, even if the outside world sees only smiles and public appearances? Secrets are the currency of families. And in the Reiner household, secrets had been accumulating for years, building value, weight, and, ultimately, danger. Every whispered comment, every withheld truth, every decision made in private added to a ledger that no one outside could read, and increasingly, no one inside could fully trust. It started small. Jonah had discovered things about his parents and brother that unsettled him. Minor omissions, the rearrangement of responsibilities, quiet decisions that affected him without his input. Each discovery felt like evidence of betrayal. To Jonah, these were not mere oversights. They were deliberate acts of exclusion. And once his mind framed them that way, every subsequent action he observed was filtered through suspicion. Jake, by contrast, had always understood the power of information. Where Jonah reacted emotionally, Jake reacted strategically. He didn't need to confront or argue. Instead, he gathered quietly, cataloged interactions, and waited for the right moment to act, or allow others to act for him. He understood that knowledge is leverage, and timing amplifies its impact. Mara and Elias, meanwhile, were caught in a delicate balancing act. Mara, intuitive and empathetic, tried to interpret Jonah's frustrations while calming Jake's subtle manipulations. Elias, preoccupied with professional commitments, assumed his leadership as head of the family and head of the estate provided stability. But stability in a household built on resentment and hidden agendas is always fragile. Then came the pivotal revelation. Jonah had begun to secretly track the movements of both his parents and Jake. Notes were taken, schedules memorized, seemingly trivial observations logged for future reference. These were the signs of someone who had shifted from frustration to obsession. Mara noticed small hints. Her son's unusual focus on minor routines, his questions about locked doors and family schedules, but dismissed them as teenage impulsiveness at first. Jake, however, recognized the pattern instantly. He had always been a strategist, and he could see the trajectory unfolding. But instead of confronting Jonah, he used subtle nudges to direct his brother's energy in ways that reinforced Jake's influence. Every argument, every challenge, every disagreement was now a tool in Jake's carefully crafted playbook. The family's public image remained flawless. Outsiders continued to see glamour, sophistication, and cohesion. But behind closed doors, alliances were shifting, loyalties were questioned, and every interaction carried the weight of unspoken intentions. Even routine decisions, who drove to a meeting, who answered the phone, who handled a contract, became strategic maneuvers. The tension was compounded by Mara's attempts to maintain peace. She suggested mediation, implemented structured communication, and even brought in family advisors. But these interventions were only partially effective. Jonah saw them as interference and criticism. Jake saw them as opportunities to consolidate his subtle control. Every suggestion, every attempt at reconciliation, was filtered through the family's growing web of suspicion. A particularly telling moment occurred during a weekend retreat designed to reset the family dynamic. Mara had organized the retreat with the hope of diffusing tension and encouraging open communication. On paper, it was a reasonable plan. In practice, it revealed just how deep the fractures had become. Jonah reacted with visible irritation at perceived slights. Jake remained outwardly composed, but subtly manipulated group interactions to maintain an edge. Elias, oblivious to the underlying tensions, focused on family bonding and professional discussions. But the environment had shifted. Small provocations, comments about responsibilities, observations about behavior, casual suggestions, now acted as accelerants. Every conversation carried double meaning. Every gesture was interpreted as a message. During the retreat, a minor argument erupted over control of a particular financial document. Jonah believed he had a right to oversee it. Jake argued it was procedural. Mara attempted to mediate. Elias assumed neutrality would suffice. But the clash escalated far more than anyone anticipated. Jonah's frustration boiled over into anger. Jake's calm demeanor only intensified his brother's resentment. It was clear that the family was no longer operating on trust. Observations and suspicions had replaced faith. Calculation had replaced empathy. Resentment had replaced loyalty. And in this environment, even small actions carried significant consequences. The tipping point came when Jonah discovered evidence suggesting Jake had been manipulating the household subtly for months, rearranging schedules, influencing minor decisions, and positioning himself to gain influence over the estate. Whether real or perceived, this revelation inflamed Jonah further. It wasn't just frustration anymore. It was a sense of injustice and a desire for retribution. At the same time, Jake was acutely aware of Jonah's volatility. He observed his brother's movements, documented patterns of behavior, and anticipated emotional reactions. Jake's strategy was to stay several steps ahead, using the family's existing tensions to maintain advantage while avoiding direct confrontation. Mara and Elias were increasingly alarmed. They noticed the heightened tension, subtle manipulations, and growing obsession but struggled to intervene effectively. Their efforts at mediation and communication were increasingly ineffective, sometimes even exacerbating the situation. They were caught between two children whose actions and reactions had become unpredictable and dangerous. The household now existed in a state of constant vigilance. Every interaction, every choice, every decision was scrutinized. Trust had eroded completely. Loyalties were questioned at every turn. And in this high-stakes environment, even minor misunderstandings could escalate into explosive confrontations. By now, the stage had been set. Secrets, observations, and small provocations had combined to create a volatile situation. Jonah's anger and obsession had intensified. Jake's strategic manipulation had strengthened. Mara's interventions had failed to restore equilibrium. And Elias, despite his attempts to remain neutral and professional, was unable to perceive the full depth of the danger. In this environment, it wasn't just a matter of conflict anymore. It was a matter of survival. Emotional, psychological, and strategic survival. And the choices each member made, or failed to make, would determine not just the family dynamic but the very outcome of the tragedy to come. The Reiner household, once emblematic of success, sophistication, and family unity, had become a pressure cooker. Small sparks could ignite catastrophic results. And, as the days unfolded, the tension that had been simmering for years would reach a boiling point. A confrontation that no one could have foreseen, but that had been quietly building, step by step, for far too long. What happened next would not only reveal the depths of hidden resentments, but also expose the intricate strategies each member had employed. In that moment, the one that shifted the household from conflict to crisis, would mark the beginning of a series of events that no one would escape unscathed. Every family has a breaking point. Some are emotional, some financial, some rooted in long-buried secrets. In the Reiner household, the breaking point was all three, wrapped together, ticking silently like a time bomb. It began one evening in late November. The air in the mansion was thick with tension, the kind you could almost touch. Jonah had been increasingly agitated, his movements erratic. He spent hours going over old contracts, scanning emails, and questioning decisions he felt were unjust. Every interaction with his parents and brother seemed to spark confrontation, however minor. The atmosphere was charged, and every word, every gesture, carried hidden meaning. Jake, as always, remained composed. He moved through the home with the air of someone fully aware of the storm, but confident in his control. He watched Jonah closely, noting his behavior, his emotional triggers, and the smallest inconsistencies. Every misstep by Jonah was a data point, every outburst a window into his vulnerabilities. Jake's calm wasn't passive, it was strategic. Mara tried to hold the family together. She organized meals, attempted small talk, encouraged conversations to defuse tension. But her efforts were like applying a thin layer of varnish over a deep fracture. Jonah perceived her attempts as taking sides. Jake perceived her concern as an obstacle to his subtle influence. Elias, absorbed in his latest project, assumed the usual routines would carry the household through. He underestimated how fragile the peace had become. That night, a minor disagreement over the estate escalated into something much more serious. Jonah questioned Jake's involvement in a new project, accusing him of manipulating their father. Jake responded logically, pointing out contractual obligations and responsibilities. Mara intervened. Elias remained silent, and Jonah, already on edge, left the room in frustration, slamming the door behind him. This incident, seemingly small to outsiders, was the spark. It confirmed to Jonah that his brother was actively undermining him, and it intensified his obsession. He began making more calculated observations, tracking schedules, monitoring who had access to sensitive information, and noting any behavior that could be leveraged. Every day, the stakes increased. Every action became more deliberate. Jake, in turn, recognized Jonah's growing agitation. He maintained his composure, but his mind was working overtime. Every move he made was designed to maintain his advantage without exposing himself to suspicion. Jake understood that confrontation could be dangerous, but subtle manipulation could be far more effective. The following week, the tension became unbearable. Jonah confronted his father directly, questioning his judgment and accusing him of favoritism. Elias, caught off guard, attempted to explain his decisions rationally. Mara stepped in to calm the situation, but her words only inflamed Jonah further. The argument escalated to raised voices, and for the first time, Jake's subtle influence came into play. He did not speak. He observed. He waited. He allowed Jonah's frustration to peak while guiding the discussion in ways that subtly highlighted Jonah's instability. By the end of the evening, Jonah felt isolated, misunderstood, and powerless. Jake, meanwhile, had strengthened his position without uttering a single confrontational word. This was the tipping point, a moment when small cracks transformed into dangerous fault lines. Jonah's resentment had morphed into a focused, obsessive energy. Jake's strategy had shifted from observation to subtle orchestration, and Mara and Elias, despite their best efforts, could no longer contain the tension that now permeated every room. In the following days, the household became a battlefield of psychological maneuvers. Jonah monitored movements obsessively, interpreted minor gestures as attacks, and began planning actions he believed would restore his perceived balance of power. Jake continued his subtle guidance, redirecting conflicts to maintain his advantage while keeping his intentions concealed. Mara attempted intervention, but the influence of long-standing resentment and secrecy had created a chasm too wide to bridge. The pattern was clear. Jonah's emotional volatility, combined with his sense of injustice, made him unpredictable. Jake's calm calculation made him strategically formidable, and the parents, caught between them, were powerless to intervene effectively. Every minor incident became magnified, every disagreement heightened, every choice laden with potential consequences. It was during one particularly tense family dinner that the situation reached a critical moment. Jonah, already simmering with frustration, challenged a minor decision about the allocation of estate resources. Jake responded with patience and logic, but Jonah perceived it as manipulation. Mara attempted to de-escalate, Elias attempted to mediate, but the emotional energy in the room was irreversibly heightened. By the end of the evening, Jonah had retreated once again, his mind racing with possibilities. He was no longer reacting impulsively. He was planning. Every detail, every nuance of family behavior was cataloged for potential use. Jake, recognizing the shift, adjusted his strategy to remain several steps ahead, guiding interactions subtly to reinforce his influence. Outside the family, life continued as usual. Friends, neighbors, and colleagues saw nothing amiss. Publicly, the Reiner name remained synonymous with success, sophistication, and artistic brilliance. Privately, the household existed in a state of silent warfare, where loyalty was questioned, trust had eroded, and every action carried potential danger. This was the crucible, the point at which decades of subtle resentment, strategic positioning, and hidden observation converged. Jonah's emotional investment had transformed into focused obsession. Jake's calculated patience had become manipulation. Mara and Elias, despite their best intentions, could no longer maintain equilibrium. And so, the stage was set for the events that would follow. The tipping point had arrived, and it was irreversible. The family dynamic had shifted from tense coexistence to an unstable equilibrium, where one misstep or one calculated decision could ignite consequences that no one could control. The question now is, what happens when obsession meets strategy? When anger meets calculation? When the cracks within a family grow too deep to mend? The answer is coming. And when it does, it will change everything, and no one saw it coming. Families are often described as units of love, loyalty, and trust. But in the Reiner household, the reality was far more complex. Beneath the polished exterior, alliances were forming, silent, strategic, and invisible to all but those paying close attention. These alliances weren't born of friendship or affection. They were born of necessity, survival, and ambition. Jake understood the power of influence early. He had always been observant, measuring the dynamics around him with meticulous attention. While Jonah reacted emotionally, impulsively, and openly, Jake worked behind the scenes. He identified potential allies within the family's network, staff, legal advisors, even distant relatives, and subtly cultivated relationships that could protect or advance his position. Jonah, on the other hand, was focused on confrontation. He wanted transparency, recognition, and a correction of what he perceived as injustice. But he lacked Jake's subtlety. His alliances were fewer, less calculated, and often founded on raw emotion rather than strategic thinking. That imbalance created tension and, eventually, vulnerability. It started with Mara's friends. Observing her growing concern for Jonah, several close advisors began feeding her subtle suggestions. Keep communication open, document interactions, avoid confrontations, and encourage neutrality. Mara tried to balance these instructions with her own intuition, but in doing so, she inadvertently became a conduit of information between brothers, often unknowingly favoring one side over the other. Jake noticed these channels immediately. He began using them to his advantage. Small hints were dropped in conversations, subtle reminders of Jonah's missteps, carefully framed observations about loyalty, and tiny seeds of doubt about decision-making. He did it without confrontation, without anger, without a hint of aggression. Influence was silent. Control was invisible. Jonah, increasingly aware of the subtle shifts, began to suspect betrayal. Every minor detail, every slight variation in routine, every whispered suggestion became evidence of conspiracy. He questioned loyalty, tested intentions, and began monitoring the behaviors of those around him, family, staff, and friends. Every interaction became a potential threat or an opportunity to assert control. At the same time, Jake continued his quiet orchestration. He maintained his calm demeanor while positioning himself as the rational, trustworthy member of the family. To outsiders, he was dependable, composed, and level-headed. To those inside, he was both a guide and a subtle manipulator, guiding the flow of information to ensure outcomes aligned with his long-term objectives. The tension was compounded by Mara's well-intentioned interventions. She remained an advocate for transparency and communication, but often unwittingly escalated the psychological warfare between the brothers. Every suggestion she made, every attempt to mediate, was filtered through the lens of suspicion and emotion. Jonah interpreted guidance as interference. Jake interpreted guidance as leverage. One pivotal moment occurred during a private conversation between Mara and Jake. She confided her concerns about Jonah's growing obsession and his unpredictable behavior. Jake listened calmly, offering reassurances and subtly guiding Mara's perceptions of her son. By the end of the discussion, Mara was inadvertently aligned with Jake's perspective, seeing Jonah as volatile, impulsive, and potentially dangerous. This alignment, however unintentional, further strengthened Jake's influence within the household. Meanwhile, Jonah began to form his own alliances, though less sophisticated. He sought support from staff members and a few distant relatives who sympathized with his grievances. But his alliances were often based on shared emotion rather than strategy, leaving him vulnerable to subtle manipulation. Jake recognized this immediately and adjusted his behavior accordingly, allowing Jonah's network to strengthen in appearance while simultaneously undermining its effectiveness through misinformation and subtle psychological tactics. This period also marked a significant shift in the power dynamics within the household. Jonah's growing obsession and visible agitation created fear, mistrust, and hesitation in interactions with the family. Jake's calm, composed demeanor projected stability and reliability, reinforcing his influence over Mara and Elias. The family's equilibrium, already fragile, now hinged on Jake's ability to maintain control while avoiding direct confrontation. At the same time, the brothers' psychological battle intensified. Jonah began monitoring schedules, tracking behaviors, and attempting to predict Jake's responses. He questioned motives, tested reactions, and engaged in subtle provocations to gauge his brother's strategy. Jake, in turn, observed these patterns, noting weaknesses, anticipating moves, and subtly manipulating outcomes to maintain his advantage. By now, the household had become a complex web of observation, strategy, and covert influence. Every interaction, every decision, every casual remark carried multiple layers of meaning. Trust had eroded, loyalty was fluid, and the boundaries between observation, manipulation, and direct action had blurred. The secret alliances were reaching their peak. Mara, unintentionally influenced by Jake, acted as an information conduit. Jonah's less strategic alliances created tension and opportunity. Jake's network, subtle and calculated, allowed him to anticipate events, guide outcomes, and maintain psychological leverage. The family's equilibrium depended entirely on these invisible structures, and any disruption could trigger irreversible consequences. The tipping point was near. With alliances solidified, tension heightened, and psychological pressure mounting, the Reiner household was on the verge of transformation. The simmering conflict, once contained by routine and hierarchy, was now ready to erupt. And then came the subtle trigger, an event that seemed minor at the time, but would ultimately accelerate the downward spiral. A miscommunication regarding a financial decision, combined with Jonah's growing obsession and Jake's calculated response, created an immediate, tangible fracture in the household. The minor spark ignited latent tensions, sending the family dynamic into an unpredictable trajectory. In these high-stakes environments, it's rarely a single action that causes catastrophe. It's the accumulation of decisions, observations, and psychological manipulations. The Reiner household had reached that accumulation point, and once the tipping point was crossed, control would become an illusion, consequences would accelerate, and the boundaries between observation, influence, and action would collapse entirely. The question now is, who would act first? The impulsive, angry brother? The calculating, strategic brother? Or the parents, caught in the crossfire, attempting to restore balance? In every story of conflict, there comes a moment when the tension transitions from psychological warfare to tangible action. In the Reiner household, that moment arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, before exploding into chaos. It began not with shouting, not with confrontation, but with a violation of trust. Jonah had been obsessively tracking schedules, movements, and conversations for weeks. Every detail, no matter how small, became fodder for his growing sense of injustice. The house, once a sanctuary, had become a minefield of suspicion. Every locked door, every brief glance, every private discussion was interpreted as evidence of manipulation or betrayal. And Jonah, driven by a need to reclaim control, decided to act. The first violation was subtle but deliberate. Jonah entered his parents' private study, a space long considered off-limits, and began examining sensitive documents. Contracts, letters, and financial statements were scrutinized and, in some cases, rearranged. There was no physical damage, no confrontation, no noise. But the act itself was a breach of trust so profound that its impact would ripple through the household in ways no one anticipated. Mara discovered the intrusion first. She noticed small anomalies, documents slightly out of place, notes missing, and a lingering sense of disturbance in the room. She confronted Jonah gently at first, attempting to frame her concern as care rather than accusation. But Jonah, defensive and frustrated, denied wrongdoing, framing his actions as necessary oversight. The emotional tension spiked instantly. Jake observed the interaction quietly, as always. He noticed Jonah's defensive posture, the subtle inconsistencies in his explanation, and Mara's conflicted reaction. This was not just a breach of trust, it was an opportunity. Jake began subtly influencing Mara's perception, highlighting Jonah's volatility while maintaining his own calm, rational persona. His influence over her perspective strengthened further, shifting the household dynamics even more in his favor. Elias, meanwhile, remained unaware of the full extent of the violation. Preoccupied with work and trusting in Mara's judgment, he assumed the minor incident would resolve itself. He did not yet grasp how profoundly this breach had destabilized the household, how it had transformed suspicion into active mistrust, and how it had shifted the psychological balance. The first violation marked the beginning of an escalation that would no longer be contained by routine or mediation. Jonah's actions had crossed a line. Trust, already fragile, was shattered. And while Jake did not act immediately, he began positioning himself to leverage the situation strategically, understanding that chaos could be a tool if used correctly. In the days that followed, tension intensified. Jonah's behavior became increasingly erratic. He questioned every interaction, scrutinized every document, and monitored every movement in the house. Minor disagreements escalated into arguments. Casual conversations became battlegrounds. And Jake, ever the strategist, maintained his calm, using Jonah's volatility as a guide to direct perceptions, shape narratives, and consolidate his influence. Mara and Elias struggled to regain control. Attempts at intervention, structured discussions, mediation, even temporary separation of spaces, failed to restore equilibrium. Jonah perceived these efforts as further betrayal. Jake perceived them as opportunities. The psychological pressure in the household grew to unbearable levels. Then came another subtle act of violation. Jonah intercepted communications between Elias and external advisors, reading messages intended to remain private. He began compiling a dossier of perceived slights, manipulations, and strategic decisions made by both Jake and Elias. His obsessive cataloging transformed minor incidents into a narrative of conspiracy and betrayal, deepening his sense of justification for any future actions. Jake, recognizing the trajectory, intensified his subtle influence. He allowed Jonah to focus on these perceived injustices, while quietly guiding Mara's perceptions of the situation. By controlling the flow of information and shaping interpretations, Jake maintained a psychological advantage without ever resorting to direct confrontation. The first violation had a cascading effect. Trust within the household deteriorated rapidly. Jonah's actions prompted defensive responses from Mara and Elias, which Jonah interpreted as further validation of his grievances. Jake, meanwhile, leveraged the situation to strengthen his strategic position. The family dynamic, once tense but manageable, had now become volatile, unpredictable, and dangerous. Friends and neighbors began noticing subtle changes in the household atmosphere. Jonah's agitation was visible, his frustration palpable. Jake's composed demeanor contrasted sharply, reinforcing perceptions of control and rationality. Mara's attempts to mediate seemed increasingly ineffectual. Elias remained partially oblivious, unaware of how rapidly the household equilibrium had eroded. The first violation, subtle as it was, had set a precedent. Boundaries had been crossed. Trust had been broken, and the psychological landscape of the Reiner household had shifted irreversibly. The stage was now set for further escalation, and the path toward tragedy had begun. As the days progressed, Jonah's behavior continued to escalate. Minor provocations, small disagreements, and perceived betrayals acted as accelerants, intensifying his focus and obsession. Jake continued his strategic observation, guiding interactions subtly to reinforce his influence and maintain control over perceptions. Mara and Elias, despite their efforts, could no longer stabilize the household environment. The tipping point was approaching. The first violation had ignited a chain reaction, demonstrating how fragile trust can be when combined with obsession, resentment, and strategic manipulation. The household was now a high-stakes psychological battleground, where any misstep could trigger irreversible consequences. The question now is, how far will a family member go when trust is shattered, when resentment is weaponized, and when calculation meets obsession? After the first violation, the Reiner household entered a new, darker phase. The fragile equilibrium that had held for decades was now shattered. Trust, once a silent bond, was replaced by suspicion. Every conversation, every gesture, every glance carried hidden meaning. The family was unraveling. Jonah's behavior escalated rapidly. The violation of his parents' study had emboldened him, confirming, in his mind, that control and oversight were being denied to him. Every interaction became a test. Was he being manipulated again? Was Jake hiding another secret? Was Mara covertly siding with his brother? The questions multiplied, each one fueling his obsession. Jake, ever calculating, continued his strategy. He knew that Jonah's volatility could be used to his advantage. By remaining calm and measured, Jake maintained the appearance of rationality while subtly shaping perceptions within the household. Every reaction from Jonah became a tool, every argument a chess move. And Mara, despite her best efforts, was increasingly influenced by Jake's calm authority, aligning her perception with his, sometimes unwittingly. The first cracks that had appeared in the family's foundation now widened into gaping chasms. Jonah began monitoring every detail of household routines: who entered rooms, what conversations occurred, the timing of phone calls. He kept logs, compiled notes, and mentally cataloged perceived betrayals. Every detail became evidence in his growing narrative of conspiracy. Small incidents escalated into major confrontations. Arguments erupted over finances, control of estate decisions, and even trivial matters like meal schedules or who would handle correspondence. Jonah's emotional responses intensified, each outburst reinforcing his perception that he had been wronged repeatedly. Meanwhile, Jake leveraged the chaos to solidify his influence. He subtly manipulated situations, steering Mara's interpretations, framing Jonah's actions as impulsive and unreliable, and portraying himself as the steady, reasonable figure in the household. His calm demeanor and strategic positioning created a psychological imbalance. One brother increasingly reactive, the other increasingly in control. The parents, Mara and Elias, found themselves trapped between these opposing forces. Mara's attempts at mediation were undermined by Jonah's emotional volatility and Jake's subtle manipulation. Elias, absorbed in work and unaware of the depth of the psychological warfare unfolding in his own home, relied too heavily on Mara's guidance. The household, once a place of comfort, had become a tense and volatile environment. Then came the next critical escalation. Jonah began intercepting private communications. Emails, letters,